About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness really is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. And I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. And Noetic is spelled Noetic. Well, since we began this series of programs, we've focused on the various models people have developed to explain our mental and emotional experience and the experiments that have supported those models. From the earliest scientific explorations, we learned that in spite of how most of the medical world thinks about consciousness, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in unconscious processes. From those early researchers, we learned that our minds can be thought of as having three aspects: what we are aware of, our personal awareness, or what's usually called the conscious mind; what we aren't aware of, that's keeping our bodies going, and also includes our fears and beliefs about potential threats and dangers, which is the individual subconscious mind; and what we aren't aware of that enlivens our beings and guides us in our actions, which we call the individual superconscious. From later research, we learned that we can change our state of consciousness and shift which aspects of mind we are aware of in the moment and what we're capable of at the moment and over time. From the neuroscientists, we learned that while it's possible to say where in the brain various processes are active, no one has yet been able to state where memories are stored or how ideas and thoughts are formed through the biochemistry of the brain. We also saw that the responses in our body to both our individual mental activity and to what's going on around us often happen far faster than either nerve impulses or chemicals could travel through the body, and they often show up in the body before we're even aware of it. So it's clear that who and what we are, our consciousness, and our decisions and choices aren't all originating in the brain. As a result, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the brain, but is in fact the activity of a kind of field that surrounds and permeates the whole body, which some researchers and the teachers of ancient traditions like yogi or indigenous cultures that we call shamans have suggested looks like a glowing egg shape extending from somewhere below our knees to a few inches above our heads. This field appears to be at least partly electromagnetic. That is, we can measure electromagnetic activity for several inches, even several feet around the body. These researchers are suggesting then that the brain is best understood as a receiver-transmitter. It receives messages from the mind and transmits them to the body, and it receives messages from the senses and transmits them to the body and the mind. We also learned that in that process, the brain modifies whatever it receives from both the senses and from the mind to fit past patterns of experience that are stored as hardwired connections among the neurons. This is following Begg's principle that, quote, neurons that fire together, wire together, end quote, in what's called the default network, which means that we see and hear and feel what we expect, or believe we will, experience. Some of the experiments we looked at demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. This lack of brain activity may explain why most reports from those who've been through such what are called near-death experiences, do not fit the patterns of expectation stored in their brain's default structure, their neuronal connections. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists regardless of whether the body is functioning as the superconscious. It permeates and develops with the body and the brain as the subconscious, and it is told by the senses through the brain what the world out there is like, our personal awareness. Now, fields are unique patterns of vibration, each one different from other fields, and some experiments have demonstrated that different minds can vibrate along similar patterns. They resonate with each other. Such resonant minds are able to sense when the other is focusing attention on them or is about to come home. And they are changed when another resonant mind changes. Their bodies, and some of their pets' bodies, have been measured to change in subtle ways and not so subtle ways in the case of the pets, when someone they're connected with turns attention their way, even though they can't see or hear them doing so. Seeing all this, we begin to understand how it is that bodies and environments shift and change as people change their thought processes, change what they're focusing on in the personal awareness part of their consciousness. It also explains how a belief of a care provider in a treatment, along with the belief the patient has, can help a patient receiving that treatment experience healing, whether it's through mental or spiritual healing or through what's called the placebo effect. So we've learned that mind affects matter in a variety of ways, both in the body, as we were just discussing, and outside of the body. In the famous double-slit experiments in quantum physics, the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. Individuals, for decades, have been changing the patterns of numbers on what should be random grids on their computer screens, and the collective human mind has been demonstrated to change the readouts from random number generators on the network of computers run by the Global Consciousness Project at Princeton. Because of the nature of fields and because of things like the Global Consciousness Project, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual fields of mind as part of a larger field, a collective consciousness, a noosphere, or a global brain. And more scientists are saying that that mind extends beyond the Earth. Based on the well-tested equations of quantum mechanics, they're beginning to equate the larger field of mind with the quantum or zero-point field, out of which all matter and energy arise. It's being called the Akashic field, based on the Sanskrit term that means, quote, the essence of everything that exists in the material world, unquote. Building on that, some scientists are using the equations that describe aspects of quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms to describe the role consciousness plays in the formation of our material world, reinforcing the idea that thought, or the word, is a creative force in our experience. Based on all of that, we began to explore some more popular understandings of how the mind might work, including what's often called the law of attraction, in the way that the world around us reflects what we've been focusing on, and also the way we can access information in the quantum or Akashic field through insight, intuition, and increasingly channeling. Also, through the dreams and dreaming process, as it affects the body and relates to that larger consciousness. And music, the way it affects the brain and body and influences how individual minds connect with other mind fields. You can catch up on these past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips and books and authors that I mention. Now, given all of that, we're spending a few weeks on the healing process and the role of mind working with the body to experience well-being. A couple of weeks ago, we heard about how health and wellness need to be thought of in terms of much more than just the body. We also learned that a few minutes spent in the elevated emotion of gratitude several days in a row can lead to great improvements in the immune system. And we explored some of the mechanisms by which that happens. Last time, we talked about some of the methods that we can use to begin to feel a greater sense of well-being, including progressive relaxation, energy awareness breathing, and visualization. This week, I thought we'd look at some of the mind-body medicine methods that have been demonstrated to help the body heal. Particularly, how do we get in touch with that which we can't necessarily see or feel in the moment that is affecting how the body is functioning? So the first kind of method I thought we'd look at is the kind that I'm calling Ask the Body. Can we ask the body what's going on? Well, back in the 60s, a man named Eugene Gendland wrote a book called Focusing, and he actually wrote a method in that book for how to do so. He said we want to relax the body, and then as we are in that state of relaxation, calmly and quietly simply ask, is there any part of the body that wants to say something, wants to tell us something? Or to ask a particular part of the body, if it's been bothering us, what is it that it needs or wants us to be, do, or say? Gendland's focusing technique is a very powerful way to begin to break through the block between our normal thought processes and what the body is being and doing. And what you might receive if you do this practice is some kind of an image, some kind of a possible word or phrases, some kind of a memory of something that you did or didn't do, or something that you promised yourself you might do and haven't. These are the kinds of things that people experience. A second way to ask the body is through a process that got called applied kinesiology and is now more accurately called muscle testing. That is based on some research that suggests that in the presence of things that are good for the body or statements of truth for the speaker, muscles of the body will hold strong. But in the presence of things that are not good for the body or the speaker speaking things that are not accurate or true, the muscles will tend to go weak. Now, how does muscle testing happen? Some of you have already had that experience. I'm sure you hold out or you see someone holding out an arm straight out to the side, and someone comes along and pushes down on it. And normally it's not much effort to push down and be not straight out anymore. But if you are intentionally holding truth or holding an item or looking at an item that is really good for you, generally, if you have someone pushing down on that arm, it won't go down so easily. In fact, it might take a whole lot of effort to make it go down at all. When I first learned this technique, my instructor said to imagine life energy flowing through the body and out my fingertips for miles as a way to help strengthen that arm. And that was marvelous. And then my teacher gave me something that is not good for any particular body, and my arm, regardless of my holding that image, went down without any effort when that person started to push on it. So muscle testing is saying that the body is responding at an energy level to the ideas and the words and the objects that are going on around us. Many people use this technique not just with the arm and someone else pushing on it, but they've found ways to connect their fingers and thumbs using the thumb and the smallest finger, the pinky finger, in a circle and interlock the two hands. So you have an interlocking pair of circles with those fingers, a good way to find whether the muscles are being strong or weak. If you're dealing with something that is true for you and that is good for you, the muscles should hold and should be able to pull really hard and not have any effect. And if you're thinking of something or seeing something or holding something or have something on your lap or whatever that is not good for you, the muscles should pull apart pretty easily. So that's a way to ask the body, is this something that is harmonious with the well-being of the whole? A second approach that we can look at in the area of mind-body medicine, beyond the meditation techniques that we looked at last week, is to realize that a lot of what is happening to the body is the result of these default thought structures in the brain, where the brain has been trained to move around in the same cycle of neurons over and over again, and some of those cycles are not helpful. They are, in fact, harmful for the body. Usually, these cycles within the default structure have to do with painful incidents or traumatic incidents from our childhood and years past. And they've often been reinforced many times through experiences being repeated. So how do we deal with those? One way that has been used in a number of situations, particularly by Werner Erhardt's material in Est and Landmark, is to repeat the story of the trauma so often over a period of time, like taking several hours and repeating the story over and over again to someone who is listening until the point comes where you're sort of bored by it. That process of repeating it is desensitizing it. You're getting less attached to the story as you do that process. A more recent approach used by some therapists is called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or rapid eye therapy. And I'm going to let a practitioner tell you about that.
At the dawn of therapy, Sigmund Freud noticed that many patients, when asked about their childhoods, provided accounts that were too neat, too intellectual, too distanced from the emotion contained in the events to be of any use. In order to encourage more real feeling, he made a radical innovation. He asked if his patients might lie on a couch, shut their eyes, and enter a dreamy state that he called free association. He soon found that these patients recovered far faster than those who insisted on sitting in chairs. As a result, there are now couches in therapy rooms around the world, and the past has, for many of us, been a lot easier to access. Then, in the early 1990s, an American psychologist called Francine Shapiro became fascinated, as Freud had been, with the damage done in therapy by our tendencies to intellectualize the past rather than relive it. Not coincidentally, Shapiro was at work on a PhD in English literature, which drew her attention to a key difference between the methods of the non-fiction essay and those of the novel. In the former, an author provides neat summaries of positions and emotions. They might tell us that their mother was often sad and their father frightening. But novelists do something very different. They provide us with scenes. They don't state, they show. They take us to a particular moment and let us experience it vividly through our senses. With this distinction in mind, Shapiro wondered if patients in therapy could become more like novelists of their childhoods rather than just their non-fiction narrators. And it was here that she stumbled on a remarkable phenomenon. When we are asked to perform a repetitive movement, like tapping gently on our knees or our chests from left to right, or look at a finger moving from side to side a few inches from our eyes, then our ordinary practical day-to-day mentality often cedes to a more trance-like speculative state of consciousness. Something similar can occur when we are on a long train journey in a quiet carriage and follow a line of telephone poles flashing past us. In this state, if we are asked to think back to a scene in our past, we may remember an emotional texture that would previously have eluded us. We become more like novelists than essayists. This special state became the bedrock of what Shapiro termed EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy.
So the EMDR process simply is a way to change the state of consciousness so that what we are experiencing is more fully present to us in our inner emotions and senses, which then allows us to get in touch with those feelings and then begin to de-energize the feelings. What we are actually doing is we are inviting the neurons to go to a different pattern. Instead of replaying over and over again a repeat of that pattern of energy, that pattern of behavior, that pattern of thought, we've introduced a slightly different pattern. And the more often that we can use that different pattern, the less the old pattern will happen. And this actually is the basis for a process that I've developed that emerged out of my own healing process when it was rapidly failing from an undiagnosable condition some decades ago. It's described in detail in the book we looked at last week, Calm Healing, which I co-authored with Robert Bruce Newman, but it's also described in another book I wrote called Making the World Go Away, which was published by Portal Center Press in 2019 and is available in all the usual places. Briefly, this process is designed to help us be relieved of the burden of the past by helping us find the emotions, express those emotions out of the body, release those emotions with feeling and with a physical experience, and then replace the narrative that brought forth those emotions with a different kind of narrative. It's express the feelings, release them, and releasing often includes a process that is known as forgiveness, but which one of the teachers I study calls giving forness. I'm giving all of these feelings that I have expressed away. I'm being done with them in return for a sense of peace and mind, of okayness between us, right? And that forgiveness goes both ways. It's not just that I am forgiving whoever did whatever they did, but I'm asking them to forgive me for holding it against them and having it shape my activities since. And then finally, we need to replace what was in that structure with a new pattern, right? So we come up with some idea, some feeling, some possibility, some belief or principle that we can hang on to fill that place as high as we can. So if the issue that has been buried has to do with being unloved or uncared for, then we replace it with a realization, a felt realization of all the ways we have been loved, of all the ways we have been cared for, and then we write a few words. So something like, in every situation, I am fully loved and cared for by everyone around me. That could be called an affirmation, something you could write down and use whenever that default pattern starts to set itself in. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is and what it does and how our lives would be better if we understood it more fully. I am Ruth Miller, and that sound tells me we need to look at what's going on in the world today and what you, the listeners, are curious about. Today I want to talk about a video game and TV show that's called The Last of Us. In that show, it's possible for a fungus to infect the brain and radically change the behavior of human beings. This fungus is based on something that happens among insects. It doesn't happen in human beings, all right? There is a fungus that's the cordyceps group of fungi that infect insects, particularly ants. And some people call it the zombie ant fungus. And it spreads by sprouting fungal structures that erupt through the ant's head after the ant dies. So somehow, in ways that we're not entirely sure of in terms of the neurology, the fungus induces an infected ant to leave the nest, climb above it, bite into nearby vegetation as it is dying, and A day or two after it dies, the fungal spores erupt out of the head of the ant, showering the colony with the pathogen. Now, there are other kinds of parasites, single-celled parasites and so on, that do interesting, weird things. There are a number of pathogens, not necessarily fungi, that can affect behavior. The most well-known, of course, is rabies. A single bite will encourage the rabid being to bite others. Another one is a parasite called toxoplasma, which reproduces in cats and infects about a third of the world's human population. The infection that it causes, toxoplasmosis, isn't a big deal in most humans. It might give them a bit of the flu unless they're really immunocompromised, in which case it would be as devastating as any other flu. And it can cause problems in a developing fetus, which is why pregnant people are supposed to avoid contact with cat litter, in case you were wondering. A rodent infected with toxoplasma no longer fears the scent of cat urine. In fact, they become attracted to it. So the parasite causes a behavior that gets its rodent eaten by a cat so that the parasite can actually live in the cat where it wants to be living. There have been all kinds of research in lots of ways that toxoplasma can be related to mood disorders and mental health issues. It may induce subtle behavioral changes. It may even encourage schizophrenia or, would you believe it, influencing political beliefs. They also suggest that chronic infection with this toxoplasma parasite can affect neurotransmitters, the chemicals that carry the signals between the neurons that are associated with reward and motivation. So it is, in fact, possible for some things to affect human behavior, but not a fungus and not the way that they affect insects. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll look at more of the research being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience life much more wonderfully when we use it fully. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org. where there's a list of the titles and other resources we refer to on each show. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.